Now that I've walked through an overview of the PrimeCheckApp case study, it's time to start taking a deeper look at each of its components. We'll start by exploring the structure and functionality of the server portion. As you can see here, the server portion is what receives the HTTP GET requests from the client and then does some processing using a combination of various elements, including the PrimeCheckController and the PrimeCheckService. So let's go ahead and take a look first at the structure and functionality of the PrimeCheckController. The goal of this is to map the HTTP GET requests coming from the client to endpoint handler methods. And that's what the PrimeCheckController does in conjunction with other elements provided by the internals of Spring Web MVC. If you take a look here, you can see we've got the PrimeCheckController. You can see the source code at the link at the bottom of the slide. There's a couple of methods defined here, and these methods simply forward to the underlying PrimeCheckService methods, which actually do the work of determining the primality of the parameters passed and then helping to return the results back to the client. As you can see, these methods are just good old Java methods. They have Java parameters like integers and lists of integers and Booleans and so on. And so they look very similar to what you'd expect if you're writing code, with a few key exceptions. For example, one thing you can see here is that this class is annotated with something that's called a REST controller. And the REST controller annotation is something that Spring processes to ensure that the request handling methods shown here automatically serialize return objects, in other words, what comes back, like integers or lists of integers, into HTTP response objects. Those are ultimately what will be sent back to the client by the controller and by the Spring MVC framework under the hood. You can see a couple other annotations here. These are on a per method basis. The GET mapping annotation is used by Spring to automatically map the incoming HTTP GET requests onto the appropriate endpoint handler methods. That's the thing here that says checkIfPrime or checkIfPrimeList. And the way that that gets done is by passing strings to the GET mapping. And these strings, such as the string /checkIfPrime or the string /checkIfPrimeList, those are actually part of what is the URL that's coming across, or the URI that's coming across from the client. And the underlying Spring Web MVC framework uses those strings that are defined in the GET mapping here to look into the incoming URI to figure out that these methods are the ones that are actually going to handle the incoming GET requests. So it's basically a demultiplexing key or demultiplexing hook. Now, normally I would write these as symbolic constants. I wouldn't use strings like this, and you'll see why when we start talking about the client. I just wrote it like this so you could see what it looks like kind of under the hood. There's another annotation here that's the @requestParam annotation, and this is used for various purposes in Spring. In this particular case, it's used to indicate that this is a list that's being passed. And the way this comes in, as we'll see when we talk about the client, it actually comes in as a string of comma-separated string values that are actually integers, and then the Spring Web MVC framework will go ahead and convert those into a Java list, with the integers being the Java native types at that point. So this request param is needed to tell Spring to do that kind of a mapping. Now that we've talked about the PrimeCheckController, let's focus on the structure and functionality of the PrimeCheckService. So this is the class that actually does the business logic. It defines the implementation methods that are forwarded to it from the PrimeCheckController, which in turn, of course, gets the information from the client. So as you can see, we also have an annotation here. This is the @service annotation, and this annotation indicates that this class implements the business logic, which just means the application-specific logic. And it also enables the auto-detection and the wiring of dependent implementation classes using a technique called class path scanning. And we'll see that a little bit later when we look at the source code in more detail. You can see here there's a method called checkIfPrime. Notice there are no other annotations on these methods, unlike the controller, because at this point everything is in Java native types. So we have checkIfPrime, which takes an integer prime candidate, and it will check to see if the value is prime. And if it is prime, it returns 0. If it doesn't find it to be prime, it returns the smallest factor that can be used to divide the number. And so that's what check if prime does. There's also check if prime list, which, as the name implies, takes a list of integers, and it will then have an algorithm that checks to see each of those integers, whether they are prime or not, once again returning a corresponding return list that will have either 0 if it's a prime number or the smallest factor if it's not a prime number. There's also a second parameter that's passed to check if prime list, and this is a Boolean. And if the parameter is true, then the implementation of check if prime list will use a parallel stream. Otherwise, if it's false, then a sequential stream will be used. So let's actually take a look and see what that looks like if you, again, peek under the hood at the implementation of check if prime list. And you can see here that this implementation starts by converting the prime candidates list into a stream. Then we do this little clever idiom to check if the Boolean flag is true. We turn on parallelism for the stream. And in either case, whether it's parallel or not, we then map each element in the stream using the isPrime method. And isPrime is just a method that computes to see if the number is prime. And we'll look at that implementation later. That result stream is then collected into a list, and that list is then returned as the result from the check if prime list service implementation method. So that's the end of the overview, kind of the structure and functionality of the server components, PrimeCheckController and PrimeCheckService.